Right, show of hands. How many of you write mobile apps like iOS, Android, Windows Phone, Windows? All right. How many of you like C#? All right, most of you. How many of you like Visual Studio? Okay, those of you who did not raise your hand in the last two questions, you should try Visual Studio and C#, because that's the only reason you wouldn't have raised your hand. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about using C# and Visual Studio to go beyond Windows, to write iOS, Android, Linux, other kinds of apps. The only thing I'm not going to talk about, everything here integrates seamlessly with Azure, but we're talking client-side for the next 25 minutes or so. So that's what Xamarin does. How many of you are familiar with the term Xamarin? Okay, most of you? Great. So it's a company, it's been around for many, many years. It started like 10 years ago as Novell, then it was open source project, then they became a company about 5 or 6 years ago, and just for context, Microsoft acquired them a year and a half ago, so they're now part of Microsoft, but we still call it a Xamarin platform. They're part of Visual Studio. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'm going to keep using the term Xamarin, but for practical purposes, you should think that means Visual Studio and Microsoft. And with Xamarin, what you can do is you can write native applications for mobile platforms like iOS, Android, or Windows with literally native UI, native APIs, and native performance. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how we do that. And today I'm going to cover two things. First, the first 10 minutes or so, I'm going to do a quick introduction to Xamarin for those of you who are not familiar with it. And then for those of you in the room who have used Xamarin before, anybody here have used Xamarin before? Okay, a good amount of you. Then after the first 8 minutes or so, we're going to get into what we announced at Build and some of the new stuff that we have going on with Xamarin. So bear with us if you're familiar with it. Just bear with me for the first few minutes so that I can get to the new stuff that we've announced at Build. So if you're not familiar with it, the principle is very simple. Xamarin began as a company or a bunch of people who just love C#. They wanted the productivity of Visual Studio, and they wanted to use it on other platforms. Has anybody here ever written an Objective-C app? It's not fun, huh? Like, no matter how you look at that language, it's really hard to use. It's kind of hard to remember, and if you've used Java, it's a little bit better for Android, but it's still not as good and as effective as C#. So this whole thing began with a bunch of developers saying, we have a lot of C# logic already in our enterprises. We want to use all that business logic when we go to other platforms, and that's where Xamarin started. It began right here with shared logic, using C# and Visual Studio, and targeting other platforms. Now, when we began, it was native UI, so you could write your iOS UI using C#, and it's still native UI. You were using the native idioms and the native UI controls that you would have with the platform. Right? Now, when people think about it and they hear me say, oh, you have one programming language and you have one common API set that goes across all platforms, the very first thing they think, no disrespect to PWA and the web, is they think, oh, where do I compromise, right? Do I compromise on performance? Do I get a subset of the controls? Where do I compromise? And with Xamarin, you make no compromises at all. What we do with Xamarin is we have this thing called a binding. And for those of you who are familiar with .NET, if you remember when we introduced .NET, we had this thing called the p-invoke, which was a way to call from .NET into any Win32 API, so that any API that Windows had implemented that was not in .NET, you could still call. And that's exactly how Xamarin works. With Xamarin, we give you these bindings where from within Xamarin, from within C#, you can call into any iOS or Android API, right? That means there's no compromises at all. You're calling the native APIs, so there's no, you're actually getting all the functionality from the native platform, and you're paying such little performance overhead in doing the binding that is negligible. So you're not going to compromise on performance either. So with Xamarin, you get the whole power of the platform and the power of Visual Studio and C#. One of the things that the Xamarin team is very proud of, for example, is that iOS releases a new OS or a new version of their OS every year. And literally, same day that Apple publishes the new SDK, that same day, Xamarin says, okay, here's the new iOS SDK for Xamarin. So you don't have to wait 6 years. We're not doing a lot of work behind the platform. You're literally leveraging those native APIs. And then you get a lot of extra niceties, like some of the base class libraries, some of the .NET stuff that you're familiar with. So that's how it works. Let me show you in code a little bit of how this works. I'm going to show you 2 or 3 apps today. For context, I'm going to show you everything in Android. But if you go look at the resources for the build tour, all of the things, all of the demos that I show you, you can go there and run them in iOS too. I'm showing it on Android just because it's so much easier to show it to you and then show it to you on the emulator. So it just makes it easier for us to not have to go back and forth. So let's begin right here. Let me show you one app. This is, whenever you introduce or learn a new language, the first thing you need to do is write the to-do list, right? So let's start with that one. This one right here is called Tasky, and it's a very simple UI. It's just this UI right here. It has a native button where I can add a task. So I can just come here and add a task. Maybe I should have rehearsed. So I'm going to call that one done, but you guys will decide later if whether I did it or not. And then I added a task. It's going into a SQLite database, right? So let's see how this is built with Xamarin. I can come back here. I have too many demos, so here's what the source code for that one looks like. First of all, you'll see that I'm in Visual Studio, and I have 3 projects. I have an Android project, an iOS project, and one portable library, which is an assembly or a DLL that I'm sharing across both of them. So this is what I just showed you a few minutes ago, right? All of my business logic, my database, my to-do items, all of this is already C# shared code. Right? For those of you, if you're in healthcare or banking or something, you have a lot of business logic that you don't want to recertify, you don't want to rewrite, you don't want to retest. That's exactly what this is showing you. There's a whole lot of C# code that you can already reuse. Now, this is a very simple iOS and Android app. So here I have native UI. So if you're wondering, hey, how do I do native UI when you're talking about Android apps? It's very simple. If you're familiar with Android, they have this layout folder, and there they put their forms, and their forms are in this language called AXML. So you can see here, it's how they define their UI, and you can see native Android controls like linear layout, you can see the add ID resources, everything that you're familiar with. For anybody who's done an Android app, I'm sure you're looking at this and thinking, yeah, that's exactly how we do it. Right? And this one's called home screen. And of course, this is the UI, but there's also a class behind it. So I can come back here and show you a home screen class. And it's written in C#. And you can see that it inherits for activity. Activity is one of those Android elements that they use. Everything in Android that you show on the screen, it's an activity or a fragment. So this is just one of those. And it's seamless how you go back between C# and the native Android idioms. You're coding everything in C#, you're using generics, you're doing everything that you're familiar with, but you're calling onto those Android APIs, you're overriding Android methods, and that's exactly how it works. Right? If I look at the iOS version of these, you would see the exact same thing. The Tasky iOS has their own way of doing UI, and then there's a home screen class here. And for those of you who've ever used or done any iOS development, you're probably familiar with the model view controller pattern that they use. You'll see right here that my home screen is a dialog view controller. So very simple. This is how you do it. It's all bindings, and it's all native UIs so far in the demo that I've shown you. Okay? So again, we're going through the basics. I'm going to keep moving as we go, and then we'll get a little bit more into some of the other things that you wanted to. But that's the UI. And again, the really interesting thing from here is that all of this portable library right here would have been shared. And these would likely, for a real project, this would be much larger. Right? You tend to have a lot more business logic than my simple demo did. So with that, if I can find my clicker. So this is where we began. And I thought it was already a big win. People were loving it. They were saying, hey, I can share my C# logic, and I can just run my UI, multiple times. But then they said, but what if I could share the whole UI? And they went to Xamarin. So customers went to Xamarin and said, look, this is great, but why don't you let us share the UI? And Xamarin came up with another technology that's called SummerinForms. And SummerinForms allows you to, it's kind of an abstraction. It's still using native controls, but it gives you one SAML markup where you can actually go in and write the UIs for iOS, Android, and UWP using their markup, right? So they give you a SAML layer on top of the native controls. And now you can reuse everything that's in white right there. So I'm going to show you a project in a minute, and you'll see that like in the next project, in the last one, our UI was separate. In the next one, it's all shared. Like 98% of that code or more is shared. You're going to see it in a minute. Now, is there a compromise? Well, again, this one, there's a little bit of a compromise because you do have a little bit of a wrapper on top of the native UIs, but SummerinForms is implemented on top of native interfaces and native controls. So they're not like writing their own version of button. They're literally, on iOS, they call onto UI button. On Android, they call onto button. On UWP, they call onto button. So yes, you get one SummerinForms button, but it does the right thing underneath, and you actually get native look and feels, and you get native look and feel and native look and feel functionality as you go with SummerinForms. So you're not making a huge compromise. It's a pretty light wrapper, and I'm going to talk about how they're doing with performance in a little bit. So with that, let me show you the next project. Number 2, 1 and 2. All right, so we're done with this one, so let's close this. I have too many demos, so... The next one is this one right here. I'm going to show it to you in the emulator first. So this one right here is called File App Loader, and it's a very simple app. All it's going to do is it's showing some UI, and I'm going to show you in a minute how that UI was built. And this one is talking to Azure. So I have this monkey image right here, and I'm going to upload it onto Azure Storage. And then if it works, I'm going to download it. The download button will be enabled. So this is super simple. I'm just showing you how, I just want to show this one because I thought it would be easier to show you how well or how easy it connects with Azure. So hopefully the network will collaborate here. All right, I'll let that run. It's taking longer than I normally would, but it's fine because it's uploading, and what you care about is seeing the code. So let me show you the project structure for this. So this file uploader. And here's where we're at. So let me show you how this looks a little different. If you remember the last one, we had 3 projects. We had one that was my iOS, one that was my Android, and then I had a portable class library that I was reusing. Well, in this case, Visual Studio has a little bit of a different structure. First of all, this one has a UWP project too. So this is actually targeting Windows too. But then I have this thing right here in Visual Studio that looks a little funny. It looks like a project, you can expand it, there's a bunch of files here, but this is what we call the shared head. Everything right here under the diamond is shared logic, both C# and SAML logic, that's going to be included into each one of the packages that it's also in this project. So the Droid version is going to include everything here. The iOS version is going to include everything here. So now you can see how we're sharing all of our code. In this case, I show you some of the UI to upload, for the uploader page. And you can come back here and see, hey, it's just these 3 controls. One uploads an image, one uploads a text file. And so if you could look at any of the controls, you'll see right here. So here's our file uploader page. It looks to you, if you're familiar with SAML, this is exactly the way SAML looks like. So this should be familiar for you. And you'll see right here, it's got its own little controls, right? They have label, an image, and button. They have their own control connectivity indicator, which is the version of a, kind of a progress bar. So you can see everything here. It's one language, it's one UI, and I'm going to share it across iOS, Android, and UWP. So I wrote it once, and I can share it across now. Now, I told you this was actually uploading code or uploading the image to Azure. So you can see here my Azure Storage class. It's also in the shared project, so everything is shared right here. If I look at the Droid project that I showed you earlier I had an activity and a bunch of UI files and everything. In this case, the activity is pretty empty. All it's doing, it's literally has the onCreate method, and then it's just calling on to load application, new app, which is the class in our shared logic right here. So everything here is shared. The iOS version is also empty. Right, so if I go look here at the iOS project, you'll see that it's also empty. All it does is it launches and it calls into the main, and then it passes on control to the app delegate. So now I just shared all of my business logic, all of my UI, and I have applications that run on iOS, Android, and UWP, and that's SummerinForms. All right, so hopefully I'm done with my intro. Let me talk about some of the things we announced at Build, some of the new stuff that we're looking at. And for context, Xamarin is very stable by now. They've been around for 5 years. So as we go with adding functionality, you're going to hear about optimizations and new features that are just growing the platform. You're not going to hear me talk about oh, we added new classes or we added, like basic stuff, like new tools, because they're pretty modern by now. They run in Visual Studio. Everything is pretty mature. So I picked a few of the things that we announced at Build that I thought were very interesting. The first one that we announced at Build is what's new in Xamarin-Forms. And there they did something really exciting. Earlier, I told you that Xamarin-Forms was already iOS, Android, and UWP. Well, at Build, they said, oh, we're also macOS now. So if you want to write a macOS application, something that runs in a macOS, you can actually target Xamarin-Forms, and that was announced and released at Build. Then the next thing they said is, hey, we're going to go to Linux. And Linux is coming later in the year. They did not release Linux, and WPF is also coming later in the year, but they announced it, and it's coming, and later in the year just means before December or as we go towards the end of the summer. So WPF and Linux are coming. They announced support for it. They also announced support for Tizen. Tizen is actually implemented by Samsung, so they actually just released the implementation there. Now you can run it on, for example, your Samsung watches or your Samsung TV. You can run Xamarin-Forms. So again, you can write your UI once, and it goes across so many platforms, right? And you're running with C# on Visual Studio, so super powerful. Now, earlier I told you that with Xamarin-Forms, it is a wrapper on top of the native controls. So they do have a little bit of overhead. And Xamarin-Forms constantly improving. One of the things that we've done for Build is we announced Xamarin-Forms 3.0, the preview is Xamarin-Forms 3.0, and we're really proud of that one. We think that one has all the memory and performance improvements that make it just very easy for you to build native UIs for consumer and enterprise apps without having to compromise. We've optimized the platform enough that we feel very comfortable. And then we also added theme support. So if you're familiar with Android and themes, we've added better support for the tooling and better support to the platform so you can do themes a little bit easier. So we're really, really excited about the new Xamarin-Forms preview that we announced. And for those of you that are building something with Xamarin, you should go check it out. Now, the other thing that we looked at was this. Remember how we began, and it was shared logic and 3 platforms, and we thought, that's not good enough. Right? Or at least our customers thought that wasn't good enough. And then they said, hey, we want to share the UI, so give us Xamarin-Forms. And we're really excited because now we're sharing a lot of the UI. Well, customers came back and said, okay, you got it. And this is almost good enough, but now I have one problem left over. I'm an Android developer. I have an application that's 2 years old, and I would like to start using Xamarin-Forms, but I can't. Because right now the model is, I either do my own custom UI or I do Xamarin-Forms, but I can't mix and match. So at Build, we announced a preview of this thing we called embedded forms. And with embedded forms, what you're going to be able to do is you will be able to mix and match. So if you have iOS code already that's 2 or 3 years old that you don't want to throw away, no problem. You can start writing Xamarin-Forms and then just bring a little bit of UI at a time. Same thing for Android. Right? And also, this allows you to, if you were the opposite way, if you were writing Xamarin-Forms, but there was like one screen that like really needed to be super native, you wanted to do maybe a GL view or something that you were like, okay, I really want to go native on this screen because I'm calling onto somebody else's code or because I want to take advantage of some native functionality. With embedded forms, you can mix and match. So you will be able to call on, from your activities onto the Xamarin-Form UIs, or you'll be able to call the other way around. Let me show you how much code it is to add embedded forms onto our app. So 2 again. So far, I haven't forgotten. That's pretty good. Trust me. All right, so let's close this one so we have a lot less open. And I'm first going to show you the app. Ooh. Okay. The emulator, when I leave the emulator running for long periods of times, sometimes it misbehaves. So bear with me. By the way, this is not Microsoft emulator. This is just Intel standard emulator. So don't blame it on me. Just say it. Just say it. So you can see here, I got this Xamarin app. Actually, I have this Android app. And that looks 5 years old, right? Purposely, it's kind of ugly on purpose. So it's part of the story. It's kind of ugly on purpose. That is an Android form, and it's native. It was written with that XML I showed you earlier, and it's just supposed to get the weather. So I can come back here and type Sydney, and then get the weather. And I just want to make sure I have Wi-Fi, because it should be connected. because the previous demo took forever. There we go. We got the weather. So that actually called a real live web service and got the weather. All the source for my demos is online, so you'll be able to go in there and make sure that I didn't cheat. So that got the weather. And again, this is an Android form. Looks a little ugly. Now, somebody asked, hey, I wanted to remember the places that I've seen the weather for before. Kind of write a history or a recent looked up so that I don't have to type everything. Because, for us in the build tour, we visited 10 cities. So we were like, oh, I have to go back and check the weather, for a lot of cities. So we went back and we added this extra form right here called Your Places. And you can see this form right here. Now, this one looks a little bit more modern. It's a little prettier. Of course, I wrote it with SummerinForms, right? That's why it looks a little bit better. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to call back and forth between these two so that you can see how easy it was to do the embedded forms. And I have to say, I did not write these demos, so I lied when I said I wrote it with SummerinForms. Somebody else wrote it. I'm just using it. So here we have, it's our Droid app. You can see our main activity. If you go in there, you will see layout pages, and you'll see our main AXML and main fragment, which is that weather page that I just showed you earlier. Nothing too exciting there. And now I can come back here, and you'll see that I have these weather forms, weather.forms, which is a portable class library. Right? So this is an assembly, a DLL that I can reference both from the Droid and from the iOS app. And you see right here, it's got a history page, and it's a standard SummerinForms UI. You see a layout, you see a grid, and everything else that you would be familiar with from SummerinForms. By the way, for those of you who have never seen SummerinForms, here's how we do, for example, custom code that allows you to say, hey, do something a little bit different from a tablet or a phone, and we allow you to do this across platforms too, so that your UIs can be customized to the platform that you're targeting. That's how we get that rich user interface. We can customize based on on tablet or form factor, and we can customize based on the runtime that you're running in. So just a little bit of nice details, because I get excited about this stuff. So now if you want to see how we're calling onto that form, it's very simple. I got my history page right here. And all I have to go back is look at my main activity code, and you'll see right here how we're calling onto the form. So when I click on that Show History button, here's all I have to do. 2 lines of code. The first one, I have to call forms.init. Because remember, we were in an Android app, and we were not native. So I initialize SummerinForms, line of code called forms.init, and then I go in there and said, hey, give me a new history page, and create it as a fragment. And then I can navigate to it as if it was a native Android fragment. So this is how easy it is for you to do embedded forms. All I have to do is, this is my SummerinForms page that I showed you this UI for. And I just say create fragment, and I pass the context, and that's it. That's how seamless it's going to be for you to mix and match with embedded forms. So super easy, and we're super excited for it because those people who've been doing UI the older ways now can share a lot more with SummerinForms. So that's what we announced at Build. Now I'm going to move on and talk about something that, oh, that's interesting. This slide shouldn't have been there, but let's talk about it. So the last thing that we talked, or the next thing that we talked about was SAML. If you paid attention to that, or for anybody who's written a UWP app before, or a WPF app before, you probably saw that SAML was a little bit different than the SAML that we use for UWP and WPF. So one of the things that we announced was this thing called SAML standard. So within Microsoft, and even outside Microsoft, we are creating one new markup definition for anybody who wants to write UI with SAML. And it's going to be a standard, something, it's going to be a specification that anybody who wants to do UI in SAML can then implement, and that way your SAML will be much more portable. Right? So a button will be the same name as it is in iOS, Android, or any other platform that implements SAML standards. So we're converging our SAML into one single SAML that everybody can be using. Right now, this is only a specification. We're releasing the specification for V1 later in the fall, and it's all GitHub. So for those of you who are doing WPF, even WinForms, or UWP, or any sort of development, make sure you go to the GitHub and participate. Tell them what you want, because we want to make sure that whatever you need for your apps is covered on SAML Standard 1.0. So that's one thing. Pete talked about it earlier at the keynote, so you're getting a little bit more context from me on that. Now I'm switching gears a little bit, because we're talking about mobile development, and I want to talk about what Microsoft is doing with mobile development. And the first thing that we've done is we spend a bunch of money. Because if you look at this slide, here's what you'll see. you'll see that in the last few years, Microsoft acquired this company called Hockey App, and they were really great at doing distribution of crash analytics for mobile apps. Anybody here use Hockey App or heard of Hockey App before? Yeah, so really great app, very popular for iOS and Android distribution, for beta distribution. And so we acquired them a couple years ago. And then we also bought Xamarin. And when we acquired Xamarin, they had a different technologies that were super interesting. They have this thing called Test Cloud, which was the ability for you to run tests on many devices on the cloud without having to purchase those devices. And they had their own analytics, and they had a whole lot of other stuff. And then we also acquired a third company that was doing engagement services, right? So if you see this, in the last 5 years, Microsoft spent a lot of money buying a lot of companies that can make a huge difference in your development lifecycle for mobile apps. But the problem with this is, you buy 3 companies, you end up with 3 portals, 3 places, 3 of everything. So the last year and a half, what we've been doing is consolidating all of these. And we have now created this thing called Visual Studio Mobile Center. And this is going to be like your cockpit for everything mobile development. If you're doing build, distribution, analytics, it's all in one place. It's called Visual Studio Mobile Center. Of course, it's built on Azure. It integrates with Azure. And it's super awesome with regards to you being able to reuse your credentials and do everything that you're using with Azure already. So for those of you who haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you go to Mobile Center and you look at what we have, because we've consolidated everything. We have build, test, analytics, we have push notifications, crash reporting, everything in one place. For those of you who raised your hand when I asked about Hockey App, or maybe you would have raised your hand if I had asked about Xamarin Test Cloud, I do want to tell you some of the things we've added, because not only have we consolidated, but we've added new features. For example, with Test Cloud, we added 2 new test languages. We added XCUI and Espresso. XCUI is how you test Xcode UI or iOS UI. And then Espresso is a very popular test framework that people use for Android and Google. So we've added support for that. We've also increased our support for source control. When with Hockey App before, you had support for GitHub. That's why they're not there. And then we've added now Bitbucket, and we added Visual Studio Team Foundation Services. So we've added significant support. And then with regards to new platforms, they added support for UWP. So the test, or the build, the push notifications, all of those things that you used to get for iOS and Android are now in UWP. So again, go check them out. Now, a lot of people, when they hear about all of that, they think about automated builds and, building continuous integration and all these things. They think, oh, that sounds really hard. So I thought I would give you a quick demo of how easy it is to get started with Mobile Center. Imagine right here, actually, this is the lab that you're going to do tomorrow if you're coming to the hack. So this is the Nosy Android application. And what I wanted to do was set up, continuous integration. So how hard was it? Well, all I had to do here was go here, click on the GitHub button, and tell it what my GitHub credentials were, and tell it what my GitHub repo is, and boom, right? From there, I got continuous integration already. It asked me a couple questions, so I can come back here. He said, hey, which branch do you want to do so that you don't have to rebuild, or you don't have to build a empty branch? And I gave it the branch, and I told the configuration that I wanted to build. It asked me for my, my key store file for Android so that I could sign my build and distribute them automatically. And so I gave him my key store, my key store file. And then he said, hey, do you want us to automatically test on the devices? And I said, sure, why not? Right? And then the last thing I said, hey, do you want to distribute the builds? You know how he showed you the button? I don't even need a button, right? My builds go automatically. I just push my code and it automatically builds and distributes to my servers. So what about Test Cloud? Step 2 right there. Why would you want to use Test Cloud? I'm an indie developer, so I don't have $5,000 to go test on every single device. Like, these are devices that have been out there just in the last 6 months or so, right? So I went in there and picked a few. And with Test Cloud, what you get is you get test automation, and you get the ability to go pick your devices, right? Something that I do that's very common for me on Android is I release my software, and then I start seeing the crashes and the analytics, and then I'm like, oh, why am I crashing on this Nexus something phone? And then I just go test, through Test Cloud, I can go test on the right phone, and I don't have to buy it. So it's much easier, much better for you to do a little bit of testing and automation, and it's all automated, which is another nice thing about it. With regards to distribution, we have different ways to distribute, right? Hockey App was built around distributing beta software, and that is still a strength, and they continue to do it really well. So that means, I go in there, I push my code, it automatically builds, it automatically tests, and then emails all my beta testers and say, hey, there's a build waiting for you already. Now, Hockey app can also now publish onto, for example, the Google Play Store. And soon we also be able to publish onto the UWP Store, onto the Windows Store. So from there, you can distribute straight onto the store if you want to. So super nice feature, super convenient. And then the last one that I want to highlight with Mobile Center is analytics, right? If you're writing a mobile app, you need to have good crash analytics and you need to have good user analytics. And that's easy to do, right? The problem with doing it on other platforms is if you write an iOS app and you try to go get your crashes from iOS or from Apple, then you have to go to Google Play to get your crashes for Android from a different place. You have to go to the Windows stores. Here with with Mobile Center, you can get all of it in one place. So now you can see how you're doing and compare across platforms and see how you're doing across all the platforms in one dev center, in one location. So the analytics that we have are very convenient with regards to being able to do it all in one place. And you can do custom analytics, so you can write your own, and then you also can get crash analytics that are automated in there. And because we have Xamarin SDKs, it's super trivial for you to write the code. And we also have native SDKs for you to do the analytics, of course. So that's Mobile Center, and that is Xamarin. And my takeaway for you today is if you're doing mobile development, try to use C# and try to use Visual Studio and Mobile Center to develop cross-platform apps because it's going to make your life a lot easier. And with that, remember all of the content, every demo that I show you is up in the aka.ms/build-tour, so feel free to download it after this. And I'll pass it on to these guys. Thank you very much.